The oak-paneled dining room of my father's colonial house in Stamford had always felt more like a courtroom than a place to eat. Crystal glasses lined the table, polished to reflect the chandelier's unforgiving light, and the clink of silverware carried the same weight as a gavel. It was here, between the prime rib and the Bordeaux, that my father delivered his verdict. "No wonder you're still single at 35, Judge Richard Hartwell said, his voice steady and deliberate, as if reading from the record. Laughter rippled down the table. My aunt hid her smile behind her napkin. My cousin Bradley's fiancé forced a polite chuckle, and the rest played their roles in the family theater. I did what I'd been trained to do since childhood. I kept my posture straight, my expression neutral, and my true thoughts buried deep where no one could reach them. Only I knew that 20 minutes earlier, Ethan had kissed me in the parking lot of a country club down the road. Only I knew that our daughter, Clara, was back in Portland, probably arranging her dolls into a pretend courtroom, arguing fiercely about bedtime. My father thought he was mocking a failure. In reality, he was mocking a woman who had already built the life he never imagined for her. I sipped my wine, the way he'd taught me to do at 16, as though appearances mattered more than substance. My father's eyes flicked past me, already turning his attention to Bradley's career, the kind of pedigree achievement that satisfied his idea of legacy. The insult settled like dust on the tablecloth, and I let it sit there, unchallenged, while the truth pressed against my ribs, waiting for the day I'd no longer keep it hidden. For 3 years, I had carried on a performance my father would have admired if only he knew the lengths I went to for appearances. In New Haven, there was a studio apartment with neutral walls, a modest sofa, and just enough books stacked on the shelves to look lived in. I kept a few suits in the closet, a French press on the counter, and a half-stocked fridge in case my father decided to drop by unannounced. He had a key, of course. Judge Richard Hartwell always had keys, literal and otherwise. To him, privacy was simply a loophole waiting to be closed. He believed that respectability was a structure you built brick by brick, with a polished resume, a carefully chosen spouse, and the right address in the right neighborhood. Even in retirement, his role as a board member for half the charities in Fairfield County kept his calendar full and his scrutiny sharper than ever. Nothing delighted him more than using his connections to comment on the state of his children's reputations. Yet, while he admired my supposed independence in New Haven, my real life unfolded on the other side of the country. In Portland, Ethan and I had bought a 1920s Craftsman with creaking floorboards and a wide porch that sagged just slightly in the rain. Inside, Clara's crayon drawings were taped proudly to the refrigerator. Ethan's coding books spilled across the coffee table, and the faint smell of lavender and cinnamon clung to the air. It was not perfect, but it was ours unremarkable by Connecticut standards, and yet more alive than anything I had known growing up. I moved between these two worlds like an actress shifting costumes backstage, rehearsing lines in one life and breathing freely in the other. But the longer I played both roles, the more I felt the walls closing in. How long could one woman live 2 lives before the truth demanded to be seen? My earliest memories of childhood are less about play and more about posture. Shoulders back, chin high, steps measured as though each hallway in our house were a runway. By 7, I was in violin lessons, an instrument chosen not for my love of music but for its refinement. By 9, I was taking etiquette classes where the instructor rapped my knuckles for holding a soup spoon too tightly. By 12, I was already being reminded that my choices in friends, hobbies, and eventually husbands would reflect not just on me, but on the Hartwell name. I once told my father I wanted to be a journalist. I loved writing, the thrill of capturing voices on paper, the idea of uncovering truth. He didn't even look up from the Wall Street Journal. "Journalism is not a career," he said. "It's a pastime. You need a profession that commands respect." The matter was closed before I even had the chance to argue. My mother, Caroline, was the only one who softened his edges. She would slip me novels beneath the dinner table or leave handwritten notes in my school bag reminding me to keep dreaming. But when she died suddenly, an aneurysm that struck one cold January morning, the weight of expectation doubled overnight. I was 20, barely out of adolescence, and suddenly the only daughter of a widowed judge who believed his duty was to shape me into perfection. Grief gave him no pause. It became fuel. My schedule filled with internships he approved of, luncheons where I was expected to impress, and constant reminders that my responsibility was to marry well. He chose the men, sons of colleagues and old friends. Each one presented like a business opportunity. I learned to smile politely, to make excuses, to swallow my protest along with the champagne. Every decision he made for me felt like another stone added to a foundation I had never agreed to build. And yet, I carried it, brick by brick, until the weight became unbearable. It was under that weight that I first began to imagine escape, though I had no idea then where it would lead me. The job offer arrived on a gray Tuesday, tucked into my inbox like an uninvited dare. A Portland tech startup needed a communications director, and somehow my resume had slipped through the digital gates. When I told my father, he scoffed. "Portland, that's not a career move. Celia, that's running away." Maybe it was, but the thought of escape thrilled me. For once, I wanted to decide where I lived, what I did, who I became. Within a month, I packed my car with only what mattered books, a few boxes of clothes, and the notebooks I'd hidden since adolescence, and drove west until the Connecticut winter gave way to Oregon rain. In Portland, anonymity felt like oxygen. I chose my own apartment, a drafty walk-up with peeling paint and a view of the Willamette River. No one inspected my curtains or corrected my guest list. I learned the rhythm of the city, how it smelled of coffee and damp cedar, how people didn't ask what your last name meant for your prospects. I met Ethan at a neighborhood cafe, not at a dinner party arranged for pedigree. He was bent over a laptop, laughing at his own code, and when he looked up, his smile disarmed me. A Seattle native, he worked in software development, building tools for nonprofits. We started with coffee, then walks along the river, then dinners that stretched into midnight. Nothing orchestrated, nothing rehearsed, just two people choosing each other again and again. 2 years later, he stood in our small kitchen holding a velvet box he'd hidden in the junk drawer. The ring was simple, a sapphire surrounded by tiny diamonds. Nothing my father would have approved, but everything I wanted. "Celia," he said, voice steady but eyes uncertain. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," I answered before he finished the question. We eloped that December on Cannon Beach, barefoot in the cold sand, the Pacific roaring behind us. Our friends stood as witnesses while I wrapped my coat tighter against the wind and promised myself to Ethan. No orchestra, no engraved invitations, just freedom, love, and the knowledge that I'd finally chosen something that was mine. If love is found in freedom, why does fear still keep me silent? Clara arrived on a rainy night in Portland, the kind of rain that slicked the streets until the city seemed to glow. I held her for the first time and thought, here is proof that joy can be real, that it can live and breathe and grip your finger with impossible strength. Ethan cried openly beside me, unashamed, and for a moment it felt like the world outside that hospital room didn't matter. But as soon as I signed her name on the birth certificate, the old weight returned. How could I let my father know? How could I introduce him to a granddaughter when he didn't even believe I was married? His judgment hung over me, even as I rocked Clara to sleep, a shadow stretching across her crib. I built walls of deception to keep us safe. On social media, I staged the life of a single professional, smiling selfies at work events, carefully cropped photos that excluded Ethan, captions that spoke of long hours and business trips. When I flew to Connecticut, I left Ethan and Clara behind, pretending I was tied up with deadlines. I even rented furniture for the New Haven apartment once, knowing my father might drop in unexpectedly. He did, and I watched him run his hand along the arm of a borrowed sofa as if testing for weakness. Ethan tried to be patient. He told me he understood, that my father's approval had never come freely, but I saw the disappointment in his eyes when I asked him not to post photos of Clara online, or when I rehearsed excuses for why he couldn't come to a family wedding. "It's like we're ghosts," he said one night, his voice tired. I'm your husband, Celia. She's your daughter. How long do we stay invisible by the time Clara began to speak? The lies cut deeper. She pointed to her own reflection and said, Clara. She called Ethan Daddy, and then, one afternoon, while I folded laundry, she asked, Grandpa. I froze. She had never met him, never even seen a photograph. The word rose from her like instinct, and it pierced me in a way my father's insults never had. What kind of mother teaches her child to hide before she even knows the meaning of secrets? Clara was sprawled on the living room rug with her dolls when she looked up at me with eyes too clear for her age. Why don't I have a grandpa? She asked, her small hands busy arranging a tea party for plastic guests. The words struck harder than any reprimand my father had ever delivered. She had no reason to know the absence, no memory to compare. Yet she sensed it an empty chair at her table, a missing link in her world. I knelt beside her and stroked her hair, fumbling for an answer that wouldn't plant shame. You do have a grandpa, I whispered. But he lives far away. She nodded as if satisfied, but I saw the shadow of confusion linger. Later that night, Ethan stood at the sink, drying dishes while I tucked Clara into bed. When I came back into the kitchen, he turned to me, arms folded, the dish towel clenched in his hands. She's starting to notice, he said. She's not a baby anymore. You can't keep pretending your father doesn't exist. I know, I said, but the words sounded hollow. You're asking her to live inside your lie, he pressed. And it's eating at us. Celia, it's eating at me. I wanted to tell him that my father's approval had been a currency my whole life, one I could never seem to earn but still feared losing. Instead, I just nodded, the silence between us heavier than any argument. The silence didn't last. A week later, while on the phone with me, my father paused. Was that a child's voice? His tone sharpened like a blade. I deflected, saying it was the neighbor's TV. He didn't respond, and the call ended abruptly. By the next day, I learned through my brother that my father had quietly hired a private investigator. The air around me tightened, every knock at the door a threat, every unknown number on my phone a warning. I felt the mask slipping, my carefully constructed world trembling at its seams. Would the truth come crashing down by accident? Or could I be strong enough to speak it first? The dining room in Stamford looked exactly as it had the night of the first insult mahogany table polished to a mirror shine. China gleaming beneath the chandelier, my father presiding at the head like a judge over his bench. I had flown in alone, as always, leaving Ethan and Clara behind. By then, the private investigator's shadow hung over me, though my father had yet to confront me directly. Halfway through the meal, while my cousin recited news of a promotion at his firm, my father's eyes turned to me. And Celia, he said, voice cutting through the chatter. Still no husband, still no children, still wasting your potential. Pathetic, really, to be 35 and have nothing to show. The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was enough. A few smirks, a polite cough. I felt the familiar burn rise in my chest, but this time it didn't ebb. Something inside me cracked, as though all the years of swallowing his scorn had finally worn through the lining of my patience. I looked at him across the table, his silver hair sharp under the light, his posture unyielding. For the first time, I saw not authority, but brittleness, a man clinging to control because he feared irrelevance. I didn't argue. I didn't correct him. I simply laid down my fork and let the silence wrap around me. In that silence, I made a decision. I was done hiding. The next time I stood in this city, I would not arrive alone. I would not shrink under his gaze. My father was preparing for his annual gala, the one event where his prestige reached its peak, where every benefactor, colleague, and rival gathered under one roof. That would be the place. That would be the moment when the truth no longer stayed caged. When the moment finally arrives, will my truth liberate me or destroy everything I've built? The marble floors of the Stamford Civic Hall echoed with the shuffle of tuxedos and evening gowns. The annual Hartwell Legal Foundation Gala in full display. Crystal chandeliers hung above, catching the light like frozen fireworks. For years, I had entered this room alone, the dutiful daughter making her appearance. This time, I walked through the doors with Ethan's hand in mine and Clara clutching my other, her dress the color of pale sky. Whispers spread almost instantly, a ripple of surprise threading through the crowd. Colleagues of my father, neighbors, distant relatives, they all turned, eyes narrowing, lips parting as they recognized what they saw. My husband, my child, my hidden life unveiled not in a slip of rumor, but in the open, under chandeliers too bright to deny. My father took the stage, tuxedo crisp, smile practiced, his speech unfurled with the same precision as every year, praising justice, tradition, and above all, family values. The irony pressed against my chest until I could no longer breathe. Before I lost my courage, I stepped forward. "Allow me to introduce my family," I said, my voice carrying farther than I expected. "This is my husband, Ethan McAllister, and this is our daughter, Clara." The silence that followed was heavier than any applause. A gasp broke near the front row. Someone whispered, 3 years. Others simply stared, their eyes darting between me and my father. Richard's smile collapsed, the muscles in his jaw tight as stone. Betrayal and fury flickered across his face, but he held his composure, the mask of a man unaccustomed to being blindsided. Clara squeezed my hand, looking up at me with wide, trusting eyes. I met my father's gaze and did not look away. What does a patriarch do when his carefully crafted legacy is undone by the daughter he thought he controlled? The silence shattered into murmurs, then into arguments that tangled across the hall like cracks in glass. My aunt pressed a hand to her chest and whispered, "Why didn't you tell us?" while my cousin muttered that I had embarrassed the family. A few guests nodded in approval, eyes bright with something that looked like admiration, but others clung to my father's outrage as though loyalty required it. Richard stepped down from the stage, his voice low but sharp enough to cut. "You deceived me. You deceived everyone. You made me look a fool." I stood my ground though my knees shook. I built a life. Father, that isn't deceit, it's survival. He turned to the crowd as though appealing to a jury. At 35, she hides a marriage, a child, for 3 years, and chooses this stage, my stage, to unveil her betrayal before I could speak again. Ethan did. His voice was steady, firm in a way that filled the room. "She didn't shame you. She saved herself. From your judgment, from your control, and she owes you no apology for building something beautiful you refused to imagine for her." The words hung between us like a verdict, and for once my father had no rebuttal. His face blanched, then darkened. Without another word, he turned and strode out of the hall, the doors slamming shut behind him. I felt the tremor in my hands only when Clara pressed her small fingers around mine. Terror and liberation mixed in my chest, colliding so fiercely I couldn't tell which would surface first. Around me, voices swirled, but none mattered. The weight I had carried for years had cracked open, and though the pieces were sharp, the air felt suddenly clear. When the truth detonates, is survival enough, or must you fight for reconciliation too? Back in Portland, the air felt lighter, damp with pine and rain instead of perfume and judgment. Our house looked exactly as we had left it, Clara's crayons scattered across the table, Ethan's coffee mug abandoned near his laptop. I stood in the doorway and breathed deeply, as if crossing that threshold sealed the distance between who I had been and who I was now. Clara climbed into my lap that evening, her hair still smelling of lavender shampoo. "Is Grandpa coming to visit?" she asked, eyes wide with the kind of hope only a child could hold. I hesitated, then told her the truth. "I don't know, sweetheart." Her shoulders slumped, but she nodded, as though she already understood more than I wished she did. Weeks passed in an uneasy quiet. Then a letter arrived, my father's handwriting sharp and deliberate across the envelope. Inside was no apology, no confession of regret, only a single page. He acknowledged Clara by name. He wrote that she was his granddaughter, and that though he did not understand my choices, he could not deny her existence. I read it twice, feeling something shift. It was not forgiveness, not even love, but it was a crack in the wall he had built. For the first time, I realized it didn't matter whether the wall ever came down completely. My worth no longer lived in his approval. I folded the letter and slipped it into a drawer, not as a treasure, but as a marker of change. Clara laughed in the next room, Ethan joining her in some game of chase, and I knew where my home truly was. They tried to keep me small, but by choosing love over approval, I finally became whole. When freedom costs you your father's approval, is it a loss or the only way forward?